today we're going to talk about utilizing crop residues, the how and the why. So let's start with the why first. So there's two main reasons why you want to use crop residues. The first and most prominent reason is it's going to extend your grazing season. We all know grazing is less expensive than feeding harvested feeds. Okay, and for most people who do spring calving, grazing residue is an excellent maintenance diet. And we'll get into what maintenance diet means in a little bit. The second reason, and a primary reason why we do it in the Midwest, particularly in Wisconsin, Minnesota, where I'm from, is because it keeps cattle off of our pastures during muddy and snowy seasons. It becomes our sacrifice lot or sacrifice pasture, if you will. It takes on a lot of the abuse that our pastures would normally take. So we have less investment in reseeding or fixing our damaged pastures because of muddy conditions and tromping. The three main types of residues that we deal with are corn, soybeans, and milo or sorghum, depending on what part of the country you live in. A lot of what I'm going to focus on today is corn because it's one of the #1 residues that's grazed. So when we talk about nutrition, there's just a couple definitions I'm going to go over real quick on what they mean. Is crude protein, what it basically means is the amount of nitrogen that's in your different feedstuffs. It's a measurement of protein that we cover, okay? The other factor is called total digestible nutrients, which it's in the name. It's the total digestible amount of nutrients that are in a different feedstuff. So primarily we use it for forages to determine the nutrient content of forages. So this is a chart that I borrowed from Nebraska Extension's Grazing Crop Residue and Beef Cattle Guide that I helped put together when I was in Nebraska back in the early 2000s. It just goes over the basic nutrient contents, average nutrient content of corn, milo, and soybean, as far as the different breakdown of grain, leaf, husk, cobs, stem, stalks, all of that business. So that way you know what you're getting into. It's really important to know the nutrient profile of a forage before you start feeding it. How cattle graze residues is pretty basic. It makes a lot of sense. They start with the grain when they're in a pasture, then they move on to the husk and leaf, and then they finally start eating the cobs and stems. When they start eating, their TDN, or that energy level, that nutrient level, is at about 70%. And as the grazing season goes on throughout, when they don't have any grain left and they start using less husk and leaf and more cob and stalk and stem, that their nutrients drop down to about 45%. So we'll get into why that matters when we talk about supplementing. But generally speaking, an overall average, it's about 55% TDN and about 5.5% crude protein, which is perfectly reasonable and good for a maintenance diet. There's just different diets we're going to have to supplement a little bit more. Determining stocking rate. So you have this big pasture, this big field of whether it's corn stalks or soybeans or milo. Right now, we're just going to talk about corn stalks. You have this big field and you want to figure out how many animals you can put on that field. It really depends on the bushels. So when you harvested that, combined or picked that corn and you determine how many bushels, that directly relates to your stocking rate. So it's important that you know what your bushels were, or if you're renting ground, you know what the bushels were on that ground that you're going to rent. Easy way to determine how many days your animals can graze that would be, depending on the animals, let's stick with your average size cow, which is 1,200 pounds, who's dry. So she's not milking, she's just maintaining a pregnancy. So she's what we call on a maintenance diet. If we take that animal, and for example, we look at the corn bushels, we have 180 bushels, which is pretty standard. We divide it by 3.5. That tells us that that field that we want to graze is going to give us 51 grazing days for our 1,200 pound cow. It's just a simple math. It gets a little bit more complex when you want to take into what kind of animal. What I mean is the University of Nebraska has this really, really great corn stalk grazing calculator. It walks you through how to calculate exactly what your nutrients are going to be, that crude protein we talked about, that TDN that we talked about. in this free Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so you can go to this link and download it. You put in the corn yield for the fields you have or you want to rent. We always do, what it means by the stock harvest efficiency is that the cattle that are grazing these fields are only going to use about 50% of what's out there because of tramping, weather, just other factors, degradation over time. You're only going to use about 50% of the residue that's out there. Okay, how many animals are you putting out there? What's the average weight of your animals? How many days do you want to have them on those corn stalks? How many acres you're using? All this stuff. If you're not renting, you don't have to worry about cost or anything like that. But this walks you through what your nutrients are going to be and how effective this ground is going to be for you. Very easy tool to use. There are some outside factors, though, that affect your stocking rate. Big one is weather. I know we don't get a lot of snow out here. Anything over 5 inches is definitely going to slow them down, and it's going to be harder for them to dig through. They're going to be discouraged from digging through it. So snow cover can be a problem. But more importantly, ice. Ice is a very big problem because ice can actually hold down the forage so they can't get to it. Then you have to decide if you want to do a whole field, which is the most common, versus strip grazing, which we do in a lot of pasture settings. Whole field has the benefits in that cows go through and pick all the good stuff first. So if you're expecting bad weather, or if for example, here in Maryland, we tend to get snowstorms in February, you'd want all the good stuff off by then. Where I grew up in Wisconsin, we tend to get snowstorms early in December. So whole field grazing is what we do so they can get the best nutrients first. But you're going to get more tramping and a little bit more loss. Strip grazing gets you the best gains, but that's in perfect weather. So if you have good weather and you're expecting a pretty mild winter, strip grazing is a great way to do it. It forces them to have a pretty consistent nutrient intake and they don't waste a lot. But if you have bad weather with strip grazing, they might not get to the best parts, some grain or husk or leaves that are available because they're covered by ice or snow. So it depends on where you are and what your weather's like. And then the final factor is your overall yield of corn. Again, as I said, bushels matter. And how good your harvesting practice was. Was your combine running well? Did you drop a lot of ears? Did you not drop a lot of ears? Did you break stalks? It really depends on how good you harvest. Now on to the idea of using this residue and whether we need to supplement. As I said, where I grew up in the Midwest, we get a lot of snow. In Nebraska, we don't get as much snow, but we do have high winds, and so we lose quite a bit of residue with our high winds. I know this looks a little complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. So the when it comes to supplementing, as I said at the beginning, crop residues are a maintenance feed. So when we're feeding crop residues or we're using crop residue ground, our goal is to maintain the animals where they're at. It's not a kind of pasture we put them on or a field we put them on to get great gains or to even get, big gains, good gains, decent gains, any kind of gains. You feed them this forage as a way of maintaining the weight they're at or the body condition that they're at. Perfect candidates for residue crop grazing are your spring calving dry cows, like I said earlier. You don't need to supplement them as long as you're not overstocking. Okay, so if you follow the rules on how to graze, so that makes sure you're doing the right animal units per acre, you shouldn't have to supplement anything unless there's a severe turn of weather, obviously. Your spring calving cows that are thin, so I know we're not going to touch on body conditions very much here, but it's on a scale of 1 to 9. Anything under a 5, so like 4.5 and under is what we consider thin. In order to maintain her condition, you're going to have to supplement her about 1 pound per head per day to make sure that she gains that condition back and gets to be at least a 5 and maintains that condition. Spring calving first calf heifers, they're unique as all first calf heifers. They need more energy, they need more protein, they need more care. Okay, so they need to be supplemented at least 3 pounds per head per day. And that makes sure that you're getting a decent protein and energy feed. Your fall calving cows are going to be your most high maintenance group because their job is to be raising a calf at that point in time. So not only are they literally pulling off weight with lactation, but they're also going to be breeding back. So your goal is to put condition on them to feed their calf and then maintain that condition, which is a lot harder to do on corn stalks. So you're going to have to feed at least 4.5 to 5 pounds, depending on how big the calf is. As we know, calves, when they get to 2 to 3 months old, start grazing with their mom or start eating grain with their mom if that's what you're supplementing. So you want to make sure that you're giving additional grain after that age group, so that way they're having their nutritional needs met. But keep in mind that all of these supplementing points are a starting point. It's your job as the beef producer to be watching your animals, making sure that they are gaining weight like you want them to, or they're maintaining their condition. If 1 pound isn't enough for your thinner spring calving cows, you're going to have to up it. Or if 3 pounds isn't quite enough for your first calf heifers, you're going to have to change that. Keep an eye on it. It's your responsibility to make sure that they're getting the condition they need to, and they're maintaining the health they need to. So you have to keep your eyes on them. Now the challenges. So there's a few challenges that keep people from grazing stocks. Fencing's a big one. A lot of cornfields and soybean fields and sorghum don't have perimeter fencing. So if you want to graze these properties, you're going to have to put up some temporary perimeter fence. That can be costly and it's time consuming. So that's one limitation you have to think about. Is the expensive fencing gonna negate the expense you would have had on just feeding, or the expense you would have had from having to reseed pastures? It's something you have to think about. Water source. Again, not a lot of cornfields and other residue fields have an abundant water source. So we have to think about, are we hauling water? Can we run water to that location? Where I lived in Nebraska, we did haul water. We did a lot of hauling for water. When I worked at the university, we would haul water to our stock fields that we would graze on in the wintertime. It's a bit of a nuisance, but it's just one of those things you just get used to. And it worked out for us to be able to use that ground. Again, as I said earlier, weather. That snow and ice cover is something that you have to take into consideration, particularly ice, especially here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Ice is definitely going to be more of a concern than snow. Really big one when you consider sorghum or milo is prussic acid. I don't know how familiar folks on this webinar are with prussic acid. So sorghum is one of those plants. It's a really great forage, except for when you get a hard freeze. So when you have a hard freeze, you can get a buildup of this prussic acid, which is it's deadly to cattle. Particularly in this region where we can get a hard freeze, but then you can have some warm up days where you get new growth. And that new growth we call suckers on milo. It's really, 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 really toxic. And if cattle graze it, it'll kill them. So if you have a hard freeze, when you have a hard freeze with your sorghum, don't put your animals out there for about 7 to 10 days at a minimum to let that acid level dissipate and not become a toxin anymore to your cattle. So it's really important to not graze sorghum after a hard frost for, I like to say 2 weeks, just to be on the safe side. The forage is still going to be there if you give it a minute. And then another thing to consider is grain overload. So grain overload, which can lead to acidosis or foundering in cattle, happens when you have a lot of dropped ears in your pasture, or when they were combining, if the combine and the truck didn't quite meet like they should, and you dumped some grain on the ground, and it can cause the animal to overeat grain. This happens more often in older experienced cows. So what I mean is experienced cows that have been on stalks before. They learn the system and they're really, really good at seeking out the ears and gleaning that grain off really quickly. I mean, they'll eat way more grain than you're expecting because they're very experienced when it comes to grazing these stalks. And these your younger animals are not as experienced. They don't know how to do this. So ways to deal with grain overload is most important. Scout your fields. So any field you're thinking about grazing, walk it. See if you have any of these grain piles or heavy ear areas. If you do, one thing to do is to strip graze that section so that way they have only so much exposure to all that ear corn. Sometimes as simple as scooping up some of the piles, cleaning them up or spreading them out, and then strip grazing sections, letting your younger animals graze first so they can clean up some of it before your older experienced animals come in. Graze it short term. So what I mean is put them out on it for a couple hours and pull them off, and make sure you feed them dry hay so they fill up. And then you can put them back out, after you fill them up on dry hay, put them back out on the stalks, let them get some more grain. It's an alternating thing you can do if you have corn that just hasn't been combined or picked well, or has just grain piles. Those are just a couple of the major issues you'll see. Common questions I get asked for grazing is, do you have a problem with soil compaction on ground that's been grazed? No. So we did studies in Nebraska that demonstrated that there was no drop off in production for the next year's corn crop or soybean crop because of, even sorghum, because of grazing. The second common question I get asked is, do I have less organic residue or less, worse soil health because I grazed it? And to answer that, no, it's what we consider nutrient neutral. So since they're only using about 50% of the residue, you still have good coverage there, and their bodies can only digest about 50% of what they eat. So you're actually getting nutrients deposited back on the ground. So it's considered nutrient neutral, which is also handy when it comes to nutrient management plans, is that they're nutrient neutral and you don't have to worry about compensating for that. So these are just a couple resources that I mentioned earlier. The corn stalk grazing calculator, it's really, really useful tool. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And then the grazing residue guide, it's a very, very useful guide that walks you through a lot of different parts of grazing. It gets a little bit more into nutrition if you find that interesting and you want to learn more about it. It's also a really, really great guide to put together. Does anybody have any questions? I know this wasn't a very big talk today. I usually don't give long talks. But if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them for you. If you come up with a question later, then you're welcome to either call my office or email me. In November the 17th, we're actually going to be doing a demonstration on how to set up a site and use a residue grazing site at one of the university facilities near Ellicott City. And you're welcome to join us at that.